Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked. My name is Roland and I am joined by the owner and founder of Hidden Gems Books, Craig Touch. And we are back to talk about this crazy business that we're in of self-publishing, advertising, marketing our books, and everything like that. And today we have a very special guest who I am super excited to speak to. He is Stefan Emunds, and he is the author of a book called The 8 Crafts of Writing, The Map of Storytelling. And I think that book has some really, really interesting and valuable ideas for authors and writers. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. So good morning, Stefan. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm fine.
Well, it is great. I'm very well, thank you. And it's great to have you. And of course, we have the man himself, Craig Touch, owner and founder of Hidden Gems, a writer himself. How are you doing this morning, Craig?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Roland. Hi, Stefan. So let's jump into this. I was looking at the book and, the 8 crafts of writing that you put together. And I was wondering, it's really interesting. There's a lot of good information. So I'm just hoping you can sort of, start at the beginning of what sort of, made you want to write this book, put it all together and, what's the background that you have that made you want to take this kind of a project on?
Okay, maybe I quickly introduce myself.
Sure.
My name is Stefan Emunds. I'm German, and I write about enlightenment or spirituality, if you prefer that term. So I write nonfiction, fiction, and articles. And I started with nonfiction, but about 5 years ago, I got interested into fiction writing because I felt, nonfiction informs people, but it doesn't really move people. And enlightenment is a transformative process, so you need some motivation and inspiration in order to go through that. And I think stories are better equipped to move people. And I also realized that all ancient spiritual scriptures, most of them are in story form. So there must be something to it. So when I ventured into fiction writing, the first books I wrote, they didn't work out, because I didn't have the skill, I didn't have the knowledge. And I was faced with a crisis. Either I give it up or I get seriously into writing. And I decided for the latter. So I got seriously into writing, and around 3 years ago, I had a couple of new books in the pipeline that I hope will do better. And I believe that I have a strong grip on the writing craft. And I knew a lot by then, and I had practiced a lot of prose and line-by-line writing. So I was actually convinced that I could publish my books now, and they're going to be successful. And the only thing I still wanted to do to my existing books was to change the POV from distant third person to limited or deep POV, polish the prose a bit, and then stylize the dialogue. It's very important to have stylized dialogues in fiction. And for that purpose, I bought the book Dialogue from Robert McKee. And in the opening, it said something like, at that time, I thought, okay, dialogue is a part of prosing. Yeah. So if you can prose, you can write dialogues. It's a stylish thing, more or less. But when I read the opening of dialogue, I read that McKee wrote something like, dialogue's everything, even narrative, because somebody is telling the story to somebody. So suddenly a part of the whole thing became the whole thing. And in that moment, when you have such a realization, is a moment of chaos in your head, So, but I rebounded from this, but I still had this realization that I did not actually have a firm grip on the writing crafts. I've learned a lot, and from blogs, from different authors, from books, from courses, but I didn't really have the big picture, and I didn't have the overview. And there's always was sizzling in the back of my mind, is there something I don't know? Is there something I don't understand? Like that. It's like this nagging voice that we sometimes get. And I wanted to get rid of that voice. So I jumped back I jumped back into learning and tried to find an overview of the writing crafts, but there's none. Yeah, there's no. Most of the authors, they specialize in one or two or three crafts, and usually they're either on story outlining or story structure or story experience, which is prose. But there's no overview, no big picture, no map. So I thought, okay, I gotta get it for myself then. So I jumped back into studying, into learning, but not to relearn everything because I basically knew it, but to find this overview, the big picture. And slowly the image of the 8 crafts emerged. Yeah? And I pressed on, and everything I reread and all the other bits and pieces I learned anew, I could somehow associate with one of the 8 crafts. So when I was done with that, I was very happy. I had a peace of mind, and I wanted to, I could continue writing. Yeah. But then I realized that if it was so important for me to have this overview, maybe other authors are interested in that as well. And that made me write the book.
I find that. Oh, sorry. No, you go ahead, Craig.
No, I was gonna just say, it makes a lot of sense, because there's a lot of times where people are looking for help with one specific area of writing, and so they look up a book on that topic. I know I have a book on dialogue as well, not the same one as you. I think mine was by Orson Scott Card, who is one of my favorite authors. And I agree, like dialogue is everything, right? And a lot of people can't write good dialogue, because they just think of it as, I should just, write like I write normally, but put quotes around it, or, like it has to be, it has to flow. It has to, sometimes read out loud so that you can, as if you're having that conversation with somebody, and say, does that make sense? But so, people look up those specific books to help them with the one area. But a lot of times I think it's helpful to have an overview of everything in one spot, so that you don't have to go looking for all these different ones. And then, I mean, sure, you can, once you have that, you can then drill in to, if you wanted more information, you could go buy a book on one of those crafts, right? But at least a good overview of all of them. So it's great to have that as one reference.
Yep, exactly.
What really excited me about your book is that you identified like writing as a craft. I think a lot of people think writing is an art, and so you can sit down and write how you want to write and the readers will come. But writing is more like being a craftsman. It's like if you're a carpenter and you make a table, you need the flat surface and the 4 legs. And as a writer, you need to have these certain elements to make a satisfying story. And you've done a really good job of identifying things that will make a book a pleasurable experience. So it's almost like an instruction manual for how to assemble a book like a master craftsman.
Oh, yes, it is.
So can you tell us maybe what those 8 crafts are? Let's, so we have an idea of what you focused on there.
But leave just enough out so people will still buy the book.
Yeah, the book is very thick, so I don't worry about leaving out stuff. Okay, so the 8 crafts are big idea, then there's a narrative, there's genre, story outline, characterization, world building, scene structure, and prose. So the big idea is basically the theme of the story, and it can take on 3 forms. It can be a what if. For example, what if an astronaut is stranded on Mars? That's the what if of The Martian. Or it can be a moral, the moral of the story that reveals itself at the climax. Or it can be simply a story promise. For example, if people overcome their pride and prejudices, they can find love. That's then the story promise of Pride and Prejudice. Narrative has 3 elements. There's the author's voice. There is a narrative frame, which is a frame of perspective from which the story is told. For example, epistolary is a narrative frame where a story is told in a series of letters. And then there is the POV, or the person who narrates the story. It can be one person, or it can be multiple persons. Nowadays, it's mostly most of the time, the protagonist who tells the story. So genre is, it determines what kind of story is being told. Is it a thriller? Is it a romance? Or is it a horror story, etc.? A story outline is what gives the story a structure. And the most famous story outline method is the hero's journey, but there are also others. And I also give my own special story outline, which is the adversity cycle. Then we have characterization, which breathes life into the story characters, which has a lot to do with psychology. Yeah, that we give the protagonist the right motivation, the right goals, so they don't feel artificial or melodramatic. Then there's world building. World building has also two aspects. One is the world context, which explains how the world works. In fantasy, that becomes the magic system. And then there's the world setting, which describes how the world looks. The next craft is scene structure, which explains how you can structure scenes and how they can arc, and what are the elements and the building blocks of scenes. And then you have prose, which is the line-by-line writing, which then weaves the story experience.
I find that a really, really fascinating way to look at things, because the certain elements like the characterization is so important, and some people like overlook them. Like if you have one character who's really well formed and another character is really well formed, and you put them in a what if situation, the story almost writes itself.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me, some of those things remind me of the story circle thing that, of Dan Harmon's story circle, and all those different things that you have to focus on. It sounds like a lot of those are part of these as well.
Yep. Yeah, part of characterization is, of course, also to design proper character conflict. And there are also tools for that. And if you do that right, as you said, then the story, if you have the right character conflicts, your story writes itself. Yep.
Yeah, conflict is key. I mean, that's you can't really have a story without conflict, and it doesn't have to be, a fight or a war, right? Like people think of, sometimes I think people think of conflict as like, my story isn't a conflict, it's a love story and they fall in love. There's no conflict there, but there is, there's always conflict, right? It's just how you define conflict, and it's not always this, it has to be this big thing of conflict. It's, the people that fell in love have a disagreement and they have a fight, right? Or they, or something is holding them back from getting together or whatever, right? There's always conflict.
Yep.
And
it can hurt much more if you have a conflict in your home than if you have a conflict with a stranger or something.
Yeah.
One of the things that you said that really resonated with me was how you went back to your fiction and changed the point of view to be first person rather than third person. And in your book, you write about how, the writer gets parachuted into the jungle and gets caught up in the tree. And so she only has her viewpoint. And that really resonated with me, because when I started writing, I was really inspired by James Bond and all the thriller novels, which are all written in third person, which it's very easy to get quite confusing with the third person, because you, in the third person position, know things that the character doesn't. Whereas when you write in first person, all you know and all you see is what that character sees, which I think just by default makes it a more engaging and interesting story. And it sort of narrows your viewpoint, but gives you a sharper focus. And right away, that first thing you said just was a really powerful and strong piece of advice that I know has like transformed my own writing career.
Okay.
So, have you had any sort of feedback from authors that have used read the book and found it useful and anything, or have you heard from any authors? Sometimes authors reach out and about books like this, and sometimes they don't. But I'm just curious about whether or not you've heard anything from any other authors.
The 8 Crafts of Writing is not only available as a book, but also as a course on the Lawson Writer Academy. And in that course, I interact a lot with other authors. And I got really great feedback, not only because there are so many things I can teach them, especially new writers, beginning writers. There are so many things that I can put in the course, but also the things become much more clearer. Like there are so many writing advices on the internet, like sit on the typewriter and bleed, inspire your reader, write for the reader, not for the author, not for yourself, and find a great character and follow him. So there are so many advices which feel inspiring if you look at them one by one, but as a bunch they become very confusing. Yeah. So when should I be inspiring? When should I be nasty to my protagonist? When should I heed to an advice, and when should I not heed to an advice? And you can only gain that type of wisdom if you have the big picture. And I think that's the main feedback and the most important feedback I get. That suddenly they can tell which advice fits into which situation. Yeah.
I think we were talking about it before we even got on the call, but one thing that I took away from you, which is something I had to learn as a writer, is often it's really important to ask yourself these questions before you even start writing the book. I think a lot of writers, when they start off, they write their book and afterwards they're like, how am I going to sell this? How am I going to get readers? Whereas what you do is force a writer to think of certain key questions, like what point of view and why am I doing this? What's the how am I going to engage the reader? What's the conflict before you even plot out the book? And I think that just ends up resulting in a much more satisfying package. Is that something that you've had? How do people feel about that? Because I know that's frustrating advice for a writer, even though it's the best advice for a writer.
Yeah, I mean, maybe short term, they don't like the advice because they think it stifles their creativity. But long term, they really appreciate this advice, because if you start writing a story, let's say in third person, yeah, and the story develops as you write, and it becomes very dramatic, and there are a lot of internal movements in the story which you want to convey to the reader. And then 3/4 through the story, you realize, oh, I think I better write this in first person, because otherwise it's very hard to convey feelings and emotions and internal crises. And then he has to rewrite the whole thing and change it from third person to first person, and that's a lot of words you throw away and a lot of words you have to rewrite. So my recommendation is that usually a story idea arrives in fragments. Like I have one writer has a big idea, an idea about the book, then maybe an idea for the protagonist, then a few scene fragments and a few dialogue fragments. So the inspiration for a story, they come in fragments, in little bits and pieces, uninvited, more or less. And I think after this first initial wave of inspirations is over, I think a writer should sit down and ask some very basic questions. Yeah, don't need to plot anything, don't need to go into any structural details, just ask important questions. Okay, what is my big idea? Choose a genre. Yeah, I mean, do you want to write a thriller or a romance? And then who is the character? What is the best POV for this character? And just answer like 10 very basic questions, and then go and then write your first draft. And when the first draft is there, okay, now I look deeper into story outline and maybe deep characterization and world building and things like that. So it's like a mixed approach I would suggest for writers.
I was just going to ask, you said you'd written a lot of fiction yourself. Mm-hmm. And then you'd gone back and readdressed that. Could you talk a little about that, like what fiction you wrote, and then once you discovered more of this craft, how difficult it was to go back and rewrite what you'd already produced?
Yeah, there's one good example. One of the early books I wrote was a novelette. Was a novelette, a short novel, which I wrote with the Enlightenment purpose in mind. So that's a a visionary fiction genre. Fiction with an enlightenment dimension. That's called visionary fiction. So I wrote this story as a in a visionary fiction genre. And so in that story, I highlighted all the important things, enlightenment things in that story. And but the book didn't sell, and I actually already gave up on it. But at one point, when I studied some book marketing, took some book marketing courses, I realized that I could actually revive that book by first changing the genre. And then, of course, after changing the genre, I have to, of course, also rewrite it. So I changed it from visionary fiction to fantasy. In this case, it was heroic medieval fantasy. And of course, fantasy has different conventions. Yeah, for example, you need battle scenes and you need some magic in there. So I also had to add new scenes to the book. And then I had to and I changed the theme also from enlightenment to unconditional honor. So the theme of the book is a man who lost his life in a bat, and he was given 1 more year to live, but then he has to go and, get his head chopped off. And so it's the question, who would go to his execution free willingly? But this guy did. And I had to really go very deep into the character and to reveal a character that is actually able to execute unconditional honor. He said, okay, I rather die than I break my promise. Now, so I had to rewrite a lot of small things here and there in order to reveal this new theme about honor rather than reveal the enlightenment theme. So I think I rewrote like 30-40% of the book.
That's really interesting. It reminds me of Richard Bach. Are you familiar with him? He wrote that book by it's the same sort of thing. It's like fictional stories that have tales of enlightenment. But Craig, I cut you off. It sounds like you were going to say something.
Richard Bach. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, it's almost like you almost read a whole different book there on the second round, right? Like you're changing the theme, you've rewrote 30 to 40%. I mean, it's a daunting task, but I think it's important, that authors recognize when something isn't working, especially if you can figure out why it isn't working. Some people will walk away from the book and just write something else, but you put a lot of time and effort into that story, and if you have a good idea of why it's not working, you've improved as a writer and as a person since you wrote it. There's no reason why you can't go back and fix all those problems, even if it is 30 or 40% to rewrite it. That's 60 or 70% that you didn't have to do, right? So right. It's better than starting from scratch sometimes. So did the rewrite improve the sales of the book? And
I haven't launched the rewrite yet. I also worked on this book with an editor because after writing the 8 Crafts of Writing, I really wanted to put the prose on a level with which I can show off. So I had a good editor. Actually, it's Margie Lawson, who owns the Lawson Writer Academy, and we went through the story line by line. And that was another process of 3-4 months after I've rewritten all the scenes in order to put the prose on a good level, like literary fiction level. Yeah.
Right. So are you working on, so for the 8 writing craft, right? I assume that one is done, or do you have any kind of follow-ups to that planned in terms of other sort of craft writing books?
Yeah, that's just the first book in a series. I already have an advanced reader copy of the next one, which details a revision management process. So, writing a story is a very complex undertaking. And in the industry, if an undertaking is complex, you start with the project management first. And there are certain project management tools people use, and I used that in my previous life before I was a writer. And I now created a revision management process, having all these project management tools and know-how in my head, which I had from my previous job. And then I lead people from step to step how to finish a VIP, something we talked about just now. So you start collecting all your inspirations first, and then you ask your basic questions, and then go just write the first draft. Don't think about anything, just put everything that's in your head on paper. And then when you have your first draft ready, okay, what do you look at in the next draft? Okay, you look at the big idea in the next draft. And then in the next draft, you look at the narrative in detail. Yeah, is the narrative that I chose first, is it really working? Or maybe I need to go from limited POV to deep POV. Yeah, and things like that. And so on and so on. So I give around, now I forget the number, 18, 20 draft phases for authors to go through. Of course, they can skip if they want, but I just made it as detailed as possible. So you really do one step after another. And it's also very important that we separate our self-editing from our writing. And that was something I had to overcome myself, because if I took a draft and I reread it and I see a problem, I want to fix it right away. Yeah, it's very tempting, but you should not do that. You should just make a remark, and you should just say what's wrong with it. If you know what's wrong with it, you just mark that down. Or if you don't know what's wrong with it, you put a question. Yeah, you ask it 2 or 3 questions in order to find out yourself what's wrong with that paragraph or that phrase, and then you leave it. And then you go through the whole draft, and then when you revisit it, yeah, your subconsciousness already worked on the questions and everything in the meantime, and it's very easy to correct with these things or come up with different options of how to write this.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it from a project management perspective. I know that there are tools out there that sort of like help with that, like Scrivener, for example, that lets you break down the story in a lot of different ways, but it doesn't sort of, from my experience, and it's been a while since I used it, but it doesn't really give you the information on how to do that. Like, it gives you the tools, and I mean, there's some tutorials in there and stuff, but it sounds like that's a tool, or tools like that could be used alongside sort of the information that your next book would be about, in terms of the project management side of it. You learn how to project manage it, and then you use a tool like Scrivener or such to actually implement that, right?
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Did you end up workshopping this at all in your course, or
the revision management?
Yeah.
No, that's I wrote a book about it, and is available as ARC copy. The next step is I turn it into a course, and after I gain experiences from the course, I want to finalize the book. So it's not available, only as an ARC copy at the moment. Yeah.
So you'll do the course first, and then use that to revise the book, figure out what works, what doesn't, and then revise the book, and then put it. That's really.
Yeah. I want to get the feedback first from the student, how good it works, and maybe they have some suggestion how to improve it.
Yeah, it's almost like a beta service, beta reading service, but you're able to use it as a course, help people out at the same time. That's great.
Correct.
It almost sounds like you're taking your own advice in that, with the plotting everything out beforehand, even though it's a non-fiction book and a course.
Yep. Yeah, these things work for me, and I hope they can also work for others. Yeah.
So if there's anybody listening to this podcast right now, and maybe they've got a little niggling doubt in their mind, they're thinking like, oh, maybe he's onto something there. They've written their book, it hasn't had the impact or the resonance that they want. What is your advice for them to sort of the first thing they need to do?
I would look at the engagement of the book. So readers nowadays, they're spoiled, and they want to be engaged in many ways or on multiple levels. And if you have the picture of the 8 crafts, it's very easy to find where the engagement is missing. So, for example, if you wrote an action story and you read your manuscript and you feel like it's not inspiring in any way, yeah, it's a lot of action, a lot of thrill, but it's not inspiring. But I want it to be inspiring. So, how do you add inspiration to a book? And if you know the 8 crafts, it's very easy, because you add inspiration through a big idea. Yeah, because the big idea inspires. What if an astronaut is stranded on Mars and needs to do the science and create the technology to survive in the most hostile of environments? That's inspiring. Yeah, or if people overcome pride and prejudice, they can find love. That's inspiring. And you add that, and it's very easy with adding a big idea. Yeah, and so you can look at each writing crafts, and that's also in the book, and realize how the writing crafts engage readers in their own way. So, for example, the root engager is empathy. Yeah, if you don't have empathy, the readers will neither be curious what's going to happen to the protagonist, nor will they get tense when the going gets rough. So empathy is the root engager, and you should create empathy as fast as possible in your opening to pull the reader into the story. But there is a secret to empathy, because empathy is character related, but that's only half of the story. You can have the nicest character and the most inspiring character, but if the character is not doing anything, there will be no empathy. But as soon as she gets mugged, or she gets into labor, or somebody is coming for her, and as soon as something happens to her, empathy kicks in. Yeah. So the character itself is the vehicle of the empathy, but empathy is the experience in the story. So character without experience, no empathy, and experience in the story but no character. Also, the empathy is not that good, because you don't have this vehicle with which the people identify themselves. And there's one more thing to empathy. We can only empathize with experiences we already had, or similar experiences we already had. So, for example, men cannot empathize with women in labor, because they don't know how it feels. The only thing they can feel is sympathy, for her strength to bear the pain, or pity in a positive sense. But they cannot empathize with her. And same with veterans. We can only have sympathy and positive pity with veterans, but we cannot empathize with them, because we were never in a situation where bullets were flying past our head and shells exploding and our comrade bleeding to death beside us. We don't know how that feels. So we cannot really empathize with that. So if we want to pull a reader into a situation the reader is not really equipped to empathize with, or a person he's not really equipped to empathize with, because the person is a person he doesn't know, like, for example, a Muslim or a Hindu or a Chinese person. The writer needs to be very careful how he creates this empathy. And I think one of the best examples how to do that is Lolita, where the reader is being pulled into the POV of a pedophile. And the author does this very well, and the reader finds himself empathizing with a pedophile and thinking, oh, how on earth can I empathize with this guy? But the writer does this with a very simple trick, with the experience of infatuation. We're all infatuated, so we can all relate to this infatuation experience, and we can empathize with everybody who feels infatuated. And infatuation is good, except in the context of a pedophile or in the context of a stalker or something like that. So that's how you pull readers into strange situations where they're not really equipped to empathize with. You give them relatable experiences.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's you've got to boil it down sort of into the baser instincts and emotions and feelings to find sometimes that root that we can all latch onto, because especially if you're writing in something like science fiction or fantasy, right? The reader's not going to have any experience with being a knight fighting a dragon, right? But maybe that knight has his certain qualities that we can empathize with, or the dragon is a mother protecting her young, and then that's something we could empathize with, right? It's not the overall action that's happening, but the baser emotions and feelings and experiences that we all share. Yeah,
Correct.
I find it very interesting. You spoke earlier about how you hadn't found a book that encompassed all of these things, but there were books on dialogue and books on this, like empathy. There's a very good book called Save the Cat, and it's about screenwriting, and it's how if you want to develop a character who people like and sympathize with, you have him save a cat in the first scene. And it seems like, yeah, what you've done with your book is got separate, really important elements and sort of synthesized them into one place.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
That's funny. I've heard about that book a lot. I've never read it, and I've always wondered why it was called that. And now you've just explained why. So thanks for that.
Yep, you don't need to buy the book now.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's I think it's such a key thing though, because a lot of the times we watch shows or read books or see movies where there's a villain, and but the story is about the villain, and we still end up empathizing with that villain, and by the end of it we're like, why am I empathizing with this person? He's a bad guy. But somehow the writers have done their job and they've pulled you in. And I think of the show The Blacklist with James Bader. He's a bad guy, he does a lot of bad things, but you're not rooting against him for the whole show, and you're always kind of questioning yourself, shouldn't I be rooting against him, right?
Yeah, the trick there is the experience of a father. We all can relate to experience as a parent, and we all can, because of that, we can relate to him because he really cares of his daughter. He even will give his life for his daughter. Doesn't matter how many other bad things he does. And this experience as a father and this sacrificial attitude towards children, we can all relate to. And that's what pulls us into being empathetic with this guy.
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly what it is, for sure.
And you used a really good example of Lolita, which is the main character is an absolutely despicable, repugnant person. And yet it's written in a way in which you see him and sympathize with him as a human being and develop empathy with him. And then there's that weird thing, the obsession and stuff. You start to have your own darkest elements validated by that. It's a very seductive book that way.
Yeah. But it pulls you to a place, because of the empathy, it pulls you into this character, and you start rooting for him. You start asking, like you said just now, you start asking yourself some very hard and tough questions. Do I have something like that as well going on?
And that's why it's a book that has been, remains relevant 70 years after it's written.
Correct.
Yeah, I think that there's so many of those, and I think that's such a really important and powerful writing tool. Is that one of the 8 crafts?
No, it's one of the engagers. So there are 8 crafts, and there are 9 engagers. Maybe I quickly summarize them. So there is the root engager, which is empathy, which creates the 2 most important engagers after that, which is curiosity and tension. So you create curiosity by raising and answering story questions. And then you have tension. Tension you create through adverse experiences. Then you have inspiration and motivation, which you create through the big idea. Then you have a sense of wonder and beauty, which you create through beautiful world description or character descriptions. That's what we usually think of when we hear creative writing. And then there is emotional thrill, which we convey through action beats, the actual action that happenings, or sex beats or things like that. Then you have excitement, which is a positive emotion, and that you usually feel the moment when the protagonist embarks on her adventure. It's a very exciting moment, but you can always sprinkle excitement all over your story by just by adding protagonistic impulses, that support the protagonist, and then the mood of the story switches from tense to exciting, because protagonistic forces dominate, and then you can switch it back to tension. And then there's satisfaction. And the big punch of satisfaction is delivered, of course, at the end of the story, after the climax or through the climax, when poetic justice is established, and when the story is concluded, and the denouement of the scene. And last but not least, we have feelings. And that's maybe also an important distinction I should make. So emotions, the body conjures emotions like fear, disgust, infatuation, or joy, things like that. And the body usually does that as a reaction to external experiences. And the body does that involuntarily, so we cannot do anything about it. So if there's a huge object approaching very fast, the body conjures the feeling of fear. And we freeze, and then we fight, or we run. There's nothing we can do about it. The feeling will come. We can only ignore it. That's all we can do. But feelings, and that's my enlightenment background, feelings come from the heart or from the soul. That's something we bring into this world. And feelings, they're not many. There's love, in contrast to infatuation, which is an emotion. There's happiness in contrast to joy, which is an emotion. And there's a sense of purpose, that we have a purpose here in this life. And of course, a sense of beauty. So emotions sell, and that's why there are romances, that's why there are thrillers which conjure fear, that's why there's horror which conjures disgust and fear. But stories that move the heart, that conjure feelings, are among the best-selling books ever. For example, Titanic, or Gone with the Wind, or heroic stories like Hacksaw Ridge. And it's very important, I believe, for a writer to know this difference between emotions and feelings. For example, if feelings override emotions, heroes happen. And there's a really great example. Do you know A Better Call Saul, the Netflix series?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Okay, so the Saul, he's an ex-con man who turned into a lawyer, who wants to be a respectable lawyer, and he has this internal paradox. He's cunning. That's why he was a con man. Sorry, that's why he was a con man before. But now he in his feeling is he's very empathetic and a very agreeable person. So in the first few episodes of the first season, you can see this conflict at play. Now, he wants to be a respectable lawyer, but as a lawyer, you need to be a bit cunning in order to be successful. But his empathy always comes in the way. So he ends up doing things for other people rather than for himself. So he keeps losing out all the time. And then around, I think it's in the middle of the first season, when he says, no, I really want to have my success, and now I'm going to be cunning. So he talks these two young guys, the skateboarders, into cunning the wife of a guy who did some embezzlement, and he really wanted to have as a client. I don't know if you remember that. And they end up conning the wrong woman. They end up conning the mother of a Mexican gangster. So the gangster rounds the three up and takes them to the desert. And then Saul, he explains the mess up and says, I'm very sorry what happened, but it was a mess up. We didn't plan to con her. And after he talked himself out of the situation, and he gets to walk. But the other two guys, they insulted the gangster's mother, and they got to stay. So this was this beautiful scene where he walks away with his fresh one life, and he has all the reasons to walk away. It was not his fault. Yeah, the other two guys, it was the fault of the other two guys, and he didn't insult anyone, so he has all the reasons to walk away. But then you can see him slowing down. You can see his face expression, this fighting between cunning and empathy, and he stops and he turns around and risks his fresh one life to talk the gangster out of killing the other two guys. And that's just beautiful to see how feelings can override emotions and bring out the hero in us.
I love that. That's so powerful.
Yeah, Better Call Saul. Yeah, it's a spinoff of Breaking Bad. And both of those shows are just a masterclass in writing. And emotion and empathy. Both in Breaking Bad. You've got the high school student that becomes the meth dealer, but you're always rooting for him. You're always, because they built the story up so that you knew why he was doing what he was doing. And he wasn't necessarily a bad guy. I mean, it's sort of, later on in the series, he might have sort of crossed the line a little bit more, but you see that evolution. And then it's interesting that they spun it off. It's not a spinoff I ever would have expected. And when they did it, I thought, that's an interesting choice to spin off this lawyer character that was a great character in Breaking Bad, but I never really thought of him as somebody that you'd want to build a show around. And then they did this exact thing that you're saying. They showed you this slimy lawyer, how he became that, and all the and his inner turmoil and his evolution from the person he was to the person he became, and again, it builds all this empathy and it's a wonderful story and characterization.
Yeah. Same with his brother. If you remember, his brother betrayed him, but he still, passes by his brother's house once in a while. No? He can't just help himself to be empathetic and care.
Yeah.
I think we're running up to the top of the hour, so we have to wrap this up. But I mean, I love this podcast because I've got something out of it. I never really realized the difference between feelings and emotions, and the way you explained that made so much sense. And what you said about when you have emotions like anger or jealousy or something like that, and your feelings like love or responsibility overcome those, that's what makes a hero. And I found that really valuable from a personal perspective, so I appreciate that.
Okay, good. It's an enlightenment thing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a ton here to unpack, and it just shows I think that there's probably a good reason for anyone listening at this point to buy your book, because obviously we haven't even scratched the surface, and just on what you've touched on in this 45 minutes is so useful and powerful for writers that I'm sure that they'll get far more out of it if they read the entire book.
I very quietly clicked the Kindle Unlimited thing when I saw it was on Kindle Unlimited to grab it. So I'll let everybody know what I think. Okay, so we are running out of time, but thank you so much, Stefan. I have found this very enlightening. And so it's been a great pleasure to have you on as a guest. Craig, do you have any final words?
Sorry.
No, I just, like I said, I definitely recommend, buying the book, if not taking the course. And I'm also going to click to read that one, because I think there's just so much here that I want to know a lot more about. And I think that our listeners will as well.
It's funny, a couple of weeks ago, we had Erin Wright from Wide for the Win on, and she's very much about publishing wide. I have to admit, with a book like yours, the fact that it's in Kindle Unlimited, as a Kindle Unlimited subscriber, for me, that's just like click instantly. I didn't even need to think about it. So there's some value in that.
Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan. This has been incredibly valuable, and hopefully the readers and listeners and viewers will think the same. If so, drop us a comment down below. Let us know. Give Stefan a shout out. But in the meantime, we will drop a link to your website and to your book or whatever you need to in the description down below. Give us a like, give us a comment, subscribe if you haven't done so already. And yeah, we will be back very soon with another episode of Fully Booked, and maybe we'll be lucky enough to have Stefan back again in the future. Thank you very much.